Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. On either side of the river is the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. With this incredible set of words, John begins the final chapter of his revelation as the angel reveals to him the river of life flowing through the street of the city. Or is that what's happening? There are a number of ambiguities in these beautiful verses, so we're going to look at them up close and look at the linguistic detail. And we're also going to look, of course, as we've been seeing it, how this echoes Hebrew scripture in a number of ways, especially from Ezekiel, as we've been looking at, but also in the verses that follow from Numbers. And we're going to continue to look at how this follows the pattern from the early chapters of Genesis, earlier with water and then with light in chapter 21, and now with the river and the tree of life in chapter 22. And we're also going to continue to note how this involves certain key words that we see in our section. So here, of course, the river of the water of life and the lamb and fruit, a unique word there. But in addition to the linguistic elements, we're going to really focus on art and imagery here, because what John is doing is producing an image that artists in ancient and modern ways have struggled with to replicate, because there's a number of ambiguities that make it difficult to paint. I noted in a previous video that if one searches for images of New Jerusalem itself, it's hard to find anything other than golden cubes in the sky or things that don't really tell us that much. But there is a lot of imagery of the Tree of Life. And of course, the Tree of Life imagery is not just Revelation, but the general image throughout all cultures of something flowing from earth that provides life and has branches. And the very idea of trees and branches becomes a metaphor for 1,000 elements of life, including your family tree and many other things like that. So it shouldn't be surprising that the image of tree of life isn't just connecting Genesis and Revelation, which it is, but in art and imagery connecting quite a number of cultures together. We won't look at all those other cultures, but just to be aware that if you were to search for imagery of tree of life, you'd find a lot of different things. In addition to that, we're hearing about a river running through a city. And I'd like to start there, because at one level, the idea of the river running through the city might seem odd, and yet rivers do run through cities very often. So I'm going to show you a series of modern cities with images running through them, and see what you notice about them, and how they might be similar or different to what we see here in Revelation. And I'll put each one up for a few seconds without the name, so you can see if you can identify them. So here's a whole series of cities around the world today with rivers through them. And as I show you those, I would note how this is similar or different to what we see. What do we see as the role of the river in these modern cities? Certainly it's commerce, certainly it's beauty, certainly it's an opportunity to move things around, whether that's people or goods, as has been through ancient times. Where do we see the relationship in these pictures between where the people live and the water? Are they connected or are they separate? In other words, is the river really part of the city, or is the river something that's dividing the city into separate parts? And another aspect to consider is that in New Jerusalem, it's not just a river that happens to run through the city. The river fills the plaza of the city. In other words, in the modern cities we see, the river's on the ground. There's presumably rocks or dirt underneath it, and there's fish and various things. In other words, it's not actually part of the city. It's not that a city was built and then water was flowed through the city. The city was built around the river for all kinds of obvious reasons that people build cities by rivers, because they have water to drink and they have fish to eat, etc. And so this is a very different element than in New Jerusalem than we see in those cities. So let's look at a few modern images to see if we can pay attention to the ambiguities. And as we do, I want to know what some of those ambiguities are. First, there's the question of where it flows from. It says it flows from the throne of God through the middle of something, and we need to look at those words in some detail. So as we saw before, street was echoed in 21:21, and let's go back to the note on 21:21 to look at something that we didn't look at in detail there, but is important now. So as we see in my note below, platea is from the Greek platus, which originally means wide or flat. It doesn't specifically mean a street at all. It just means a wide space or a flat space. So as Auni notes, it can be used, at least metaphorically, as an open plaza or city square, not just as a street. As a low Nita lexicon below my note has as wide or broad, from the Latin platea. So as Beale notes below, in contrasting with 11:8, which you can go back to, the street of their former shame has now been replaced by the street of their eternal glory. That's what we saw in 21:21. And 11:8, of course, it was the street of the city where the witnesses to the Lamb were killed. But now back in our situation, it runs through the river runs through the middle of the street of the city, and of the city is not in the Greek here. It just says through the middle of the street. So what does that mean? It's running through the plaza, but it's flowing from the throne. And as we've seen throughout Revelation, the throne is on the other side of the veil, if you will, in the sky in heaven, but not in the literal sky, but in the sky as a symbol of the realm from which the revelation is coming. So from that perspective, we might imagine an image like this from Jeff Haney, which seems to show the river coming down from somewhere. But in this case, the throne that's pictured there is not consistent with the God tenting in the midst, as we saw in the beginning of chapter 21. So this is one of the challenges that artists have. Another challenge, besides the question of whether it's coming down and whether it's running through a street or running through the main part of the city itself, is where the tree is in relationship to it. Because we have here in English, on either side of the river is the tree of life. There are some interesting words here. They're ambiguous, and thuten kai kaithen, from here and from there, both words only here in Revelation, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But almost all translations translate, in English, translate this on either side of the river, which produces obviously an ambiguity of how can a single tree be on either side of the river. And that leads to questions related to Ezekiel, which we'll come to a little later in our video here. So how do people portray that one? In this image here from Alfred Lee, we perhaps see something like that. Here's the tree on either side of the river, which seems to have a double trunk and matches up the middle. But there it doesn't seem to be a city. There it seems to be more like a forest, and the people are just gathered by a river somewhere else. You see the challenge of painting this. Either there's not a tent, or there's not a city, or there's more than one tree, or some other issue that makes it a bit of a challenge. On the two tree versus one tree, we can see this image from Anne Cameron Coutrie, whose image is called Two Trees Become One. And so she's trying to highlight that aspect of that there. My favorite, though, is from the artist Kristen Gillia, who I had the pleasure of meeting and being gifted by, an artist who lives here in Washington State, but is a regular artist at Holden Village in the North Cascades. And she's done a couple versions of this image. One which hung as a gigantic banner in the Holden Village Meeting Center, which was 12 feet across and 8 feet high. Each triptych of the banner was 4 feet across and 8 feet high. And here's an image of that version of it in all its glory. And I was also gifted, I mean, I paid for it, but I was gifted because she asked me to purchase this watercolor version, which I just love, which graces our entry area in our living room. And so you can see not only in either of those, either in the acrylic version or in the watercolor version, the tree itself is not just a tree, but a person. In other words, she's painting the ambiguity of Christ being the tree and the ambiguity of male or femaleness there as well. There's a little imagination there, but not that much imagination as we look more at the details of the story. And so she shows it there as literally in the middle of the river, which at one level is paradoxical, but John's vision is not meant to be logical. So just a few images, and one more I'd like to show from someone who's not reading it from the perspective of a follower of Jesus, Alex Levin, who's a Jewish artist in Jerusalem, but is well aware of this, and I like his image here of the heavenly Jerusalem meets the earthly Jerusalem. And he has the color in both, and so I'm not sure what theology he's trying to convey there, but I like what he's trying to do with that. So with all this artistic imagery in mind, let's look a little more closely at the language of what John is doing here. And as we've been noting, we're starting with this section here. This pattern that we've been seeing is an element from Genesis, and at the end of the section, a question of who's in and who's out. And that will take us almost to the very end of the book there. So the angel showed me, and the word for show me is a rare word we've seen, but it's several times in this section, 5 times in the New Jerusalem, really highlighting that. The river of the water of life. We've seen river a number of times, and of course this is primarily pointing us back to Ezekiel and to Genesis, as we've been seeing throughout. So the echoes of Hebrew scripture here highlight us with Ezekiel. On the banks grow both sides of the tree, and here the living waters flow out of Jerusalem, as we see. But in Ezekiel's vision, unlike John, the water flows from under the temple, out into the city. And that's the very image that was around in the time of Jesus, so that in John 7, when Jesus is in the midst of Jerusalem at the festival of shelters or tabernacles, he cries to anyone who's thirsty, come to me, and rivers of living water will come out from them. Because at the time of that ritual, there'd be a replication of the water flowing from the temple by the Jerusalem leadership. So highlighting the importance of that image from Ezekiel at the time of Jesus. And of course, therefore, at the time of John of Patmos. But he changes that to not be flowing from the temple, because in New Jerusalem is no temple, but flowing from the throne, which again seems to be in the sky, but we'll get a resolution of that in a minute. Bright as crystal, lampon hos crystalon here, and we've seen lampon earlier. The clothes of the saints are lampon, which is say bright. So they were bright already, but they're going to be even brighter because there's no need for sun or moon, and we'll hear that one more time in 22:5. Bright as crystal, crystalon was describing the sea of glass, something like a sea of glass in 4:6, but it's plainly echo here of Isaiah 54:12. We can look at that there. We've seen it before. I will make your pinnacles of rubies, your gates of jewels, and your walls of precious stones. And so the word for jewels here is the same word for crystal there in the Septuagint. Flowing from the throne, literally going out from the throne. And as I've noted here, throne earlier and throne of God were heavenly thrones, but we're going to get an answer to that in just a moment. So through the middle, meso, in the midst, we've seen a number of times here. We've already talked about platea, and we've already talked about either side. And here's another element of where we're dealing with how he develops Ezekiel. On either side is the single tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit each month, and the leaves of the trees are for the healing of the nations. So we see how much of that is from Ezekiel here. But on Ezekiel, there's trees more naturally on both sides that will not wither, and their fruit will not fail, and will bear fresh fruit every month, because the water flows from the sanctuary, as we saw. And their leaves are for healing, but it doesn't say for whom they're for healing. So let's look at a couple of details here. The word for tree is zulon here, and it's the normal word for wood, but Genesis in the Septuagint also uses zulon, so it produces an ambiguity that John can run with, which is to say, yes, it faithfully reproduces the Septuagint language of the tree of life from Genesis, but it also, as wood, suggests the cross, which interestingly is an image never once found in Revelation. Yes, we see the image of the lamb slaughtered and yet alive, and so we know that he's killed, and we see that image a number of times, but never once is the cross mentioned, which is an interesting element. Instead, we get the tree of life here as a symbol, with its 12 kinds of fruit, and kapros, or kapron for fruit, twice in this verse, only here. Literally making fruit each month. We've seen month a number of times here. And the leaves of the trees are for the healing of the nations. So fulla for leaves only here. So 4 words in this verse that are unique here. Is it simply because John hasn't talked about trees and leaves so much elsewhere? Or is he trying to do something like what the authors of Exodus 3 did when they made the burning bush a unique element? And that word for that bush, seta, is only there. So perhaps he's trying to highlight the uniqueness of this moment by using words he only uses once here, or perhaps it's just the natural language that he has to describe this. But this highlights the point that I was looking at in the last video, that the apparent ambiguity of the nations still being there after they've been defeated is resolved here, I think, is that this new tree, this new opportunity is to heal all the breaches. The word here is therapeia, which is also only here in Revelation. So as Elul notes, the healing of finitude is what's at issue, their desire to be more than what they are. And as he goes on to say, the gift of life never ceases. There are 12 harvests of fruit each year, constantly wounded, constantly threatened by this finitude which is in him. He is constantly revived, constantly healed, eternally. And so I was only going to do the first 2 verses originally, but I thought I can't help but continue into the rest of this little unit up to verse 5, where really it does stop, because the answer to the question of the throne is in verse 3. So nothing accursed will be found in it, katathema, not only here in Revelation, but only here in the New Testament. Only suggested as the curse of war, and that makes sense to other people's translations in the note that I see down here below, including this note from Bauckham, which we'll listen to the whole element here. He says, katathema here does not refer to the thing which is cursed, which is placed under the ban, as most translations have assumed. This would make the statement merely a repetition of the thought of the beginning of 21:27 and hardly appropriate at this point. Katathema is the curse itself, as in Zechariah 14:11, which we'll look at in a second, i.e. there shall never again be a ban of destruction. Let's look back here. And that's what we hear. there. Never again shall be doomed to destruction. Jerusalem shall abide in security. So what that's suggesting here is it's not that there's an accursed thing, but that Jerusalem will never be cursed, that there will never be a condemnation of Jerusalem again. And that's also another note from Bachman down below that highlights it. He says, thus Revelation 22:3a recalls the judgment of the nations, but declares that with the coming of God's kingdom, the nations which have been converted to the worship of God and the acknowledgement of his rule need never again fear his judgment. So whether that's the followers of Jesus in the first place or the nations who are joined, never again will this be cursed. And that's to highlight the contrast with empire, that all empires fall, but New Jerusalem will be there forever. And the throne of God will be in it. And that's the answer to the question. So just as the tree of life is transplanted, so to speak, from the Garden of Eden into New Jerusalem, the throne of God is moved from the other side of the veil to this side of the veil. The throne of God and the Lamb that we've seen all the way through will be in New Jerusalem, and his servants will worship him. And the worship him here, Latruo, provides a nice connection back to 7:15 to 17. Let's go back and listen to that little passage so we can hear how it echoes into what we're doing now. So back from 7:15 to 7:17, for this reason they are before the throne of God and worship him day and night within his temple, and the one who is seated on the throne will shelter them, or more literally, will tent them, using the same words that we saw in the beginning of Revelation 21. They will hunger no more and thirst no more. The sun will not strike them, nor any scorching heat, echoing what we've already seen about the river of the water of life, and no more sun. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of the water of life, and God will wipe every tear from their eyes. So the promise that we heard there is now being fulfilled, and the people will worship God around a throne that's in their midst. Their eyes have been wiped, tears have been wiped from them. They've been guided to the spring of the water of life, and they have no more hunger, thirst, and no more sun, as we all see here. And not only that, John goes on to say, they will see God's face, echoing Numbers, as we see on the parallel here. Yahweh will make his face to shine upon you, a standard blessing to this day, and his name will be on their foreheads, in contrast with the name of the beast. And it highlights the name on Aaron's forehead on the throne, as we see not from the throne, on his rosette, as we see here in Exodus 28:36. You will make a rosette of pure gold and engrave on it, like the engraving of a signet, holy to the Lord, etc. It shall be on Aaron's forehead. So Aaron, as the leader of the priests, wears that on his forehead, and as we've seen several times in Revelation, all the people who follow are to be part of a priestly nation. And then we get the other repetition that we saw that we don't need to go through because we've seen already. No more night, no need for light of lamp or sun. The Lord God will be their light, and they reign forever and ever. And that's the reality of this New Jerusalem. And really, in some ways, that's the end of the revelation, because what we see after this are a number of elements of like a last few minutes of a coach would say to kind of, now that I've given you the pep talk, go get them, and also to assure the authority of it. It's important that we look at that because there's some other elements to pay attention to in relation to the cultural context of the time and of our time. But really, the vision of New Jerusalem ends right here, with the river of the water of life flowing through the main plaza of the street of the holy city. See you next time. Bye-bye.